My name is Jen Jones, and I have the great privilege of introducing our next two speakers. Our next session is on a subject I'm sure many of you have experience in, organisational restructures and technical debt. Definitely lots of experience on my part. Our presenter is Annika Naschitzki, a doctoral student and research fellow at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, and she is a specialist in customer experience and service design. With over 15 years' experience in user research, accessibility and co-design, she has led service design initiatives across Aotearoa's public sector. Her work includes contributions to Smart Start and Gov.nz and involvement in the Better Public Services Result 10 program, which sought to improve digital interactions between people and government. Her current research investigates drivers and impacts of internal restructures in New Zealand's public sector, focusing on how managerial culture, project management approaches, and staff participation share change processes and their outcomes. Now, there will be an opportunity to discuss this topic in more depth later on after afternoon tea, so please do put your questions into Slido and then head along to the discussion session. Now, please join me in welcoming Annika to the stage.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko anu ngak tako ingoa. I am today 3 weeks out from submitting my thesis. So I am in the tunnel. And now I'm seeing all you people here. It is blowing my mind right now to be here. And yes, I need that. The great thing is that this gives me an opportunity to reflect on, I guess, my journey of studying restructuring for 3 years. And that's really what a lot of the kind of last phase is about, like the so what of all that research. So that's what I want to talk about today. And I'm hoping that I can take you a little bit from where I was at with restructuring at the beginning, which is probably on a soapbox with my fists just like, restructuring, to maybe a bit more of a kind of constructive and mellow idea through the benefit of technical debt. But we'll see, and you can be the judge of that if you want. But first I want to check. So how many people have been restructured in the last half year? Okay. Okay, that is a lot more than I thought. In the last year? Okay. That is a lot of people. That's more than I thought. Anyone who has never been in a restructure? No one. Okay, good. Okay, so we all know what's on. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research first, what's actually going on with restructuring in New Zealand, and then I want to explain how technical debt comes into it, and a bit of a kind of, what might it take to potentially move forward? That's my hope. And if you've, like the many people here, have been restructured, you might find this sentence to be very true. There exists a restructuring culture, a culture in which we reach for the restructuring option instinctively, regardless of the nature of the problem we are trying to solve. And you'll notice, this is from the State Service Commission, so back in the days, Public Service Commission, from 1998. So when Beyonce was still in Destiny's Child. So this is a long time ago that we have come to that conclusion. And that's really quite remarkable about such a small country like New Zealand. So in the years since, there have been a lot of criticism and also academic research into restructuring. And a lot of the times, it kind of goes really around the frequency of it, how often it happens, and that it seems to happen all the time. And then I guess in a way that's where I started as well with my research. But I thought there's one difficult thing. How many restructures are the right amount, right? Same thing is, if you wanted to criticize the efficiency of restructuring, well, efficient to whom? To managers, to staff, to the public. It gets very complicated very quickly. And so what I decided to do in my research is I actually wanted to just actually describe what is even happening across the whole nation. Usually this is done in case studies. So let's look for the whole nation. So what I did is I requested all consultation decision documents from all restructures, from 62 public service institutions that make up the public service, between 2018 and 2021, so 3 years. I started in 2022, hence the timing. If anyone answered my OIA, thank you very much. I know this is really tough, Mahi. I'm sure it wasn't that easy to deal with. I'm very sorry, so thank you for your time. What I then did with that data, I was able to record for every single event, the current, the proposed, and the final structure for each case, and quantify what role impacts happened in each one and how much change there was between the structure that was proposed and what was finally then established, so the consultation difference. And then I analyzed the narrative. So how do we actually reason and justify restructuring, and also what do we say are the goals of it? And at that point, you might say, well, what's written in the official documents is one thing, but really what happens behind restructuring is something completely different. And I much agree, and many people have approached me and told me their stories, rightly so, because they are usually entirely different. But for me, the most important anchor for all of this is in the end, public sector values. Transparency, accountability, fiscal responsibility. So with all those in mind, we have to hold the actual formal narrative of a restructure accountable to some degree. If you're saying you're doing a restructure for these reasons, that must matter. So please know that I'm aware that there's often another story behind it. But for this research, we have to stay at that surface. And the good thing is that I also did have a survey that the PSA kindly distributed for me in about restructuring, where I was able to ask people more qualitative, more detailed questions about their experience in restructures. And that was in June 2024. Very hot timing for my survey. That was intense. And hence also had 1,400 responses, and we'll get to that. What I found was 494 restructures over 3 years. 364 that I could analyze because I had the full data. Now, that is a big number. The tricky thing is no one else has been insane enough to do this in any other country. So I can't really compare and say we are definitely way more, way more than Australia or somewhere else. But when I take my research to international conferences, usually what I've learned I had to explain to people in other jurisdictions, public management scholars, that in New Zealand, managers are allowed to decide that they want to restructure their teams and then do that. And that's usually when the jaws drop of my colleagues, because that is unusual in the world. And that, living in New Zealand, you don't know this. So I do think it's quite likely that we have a pretty high number of restructures, but I'm hoping someone else will go out and do the legwork to compare. 33,000 roles were part of those restructures. So the ones that I could count. And that means that approximately 73% of the whole public workforce have been restructured at least once within 3 years. And the finance team of EQC was restructured 3 times in 13 months. They were the most extreme case. Of course, there was also plenty of teams who don't get restructured within 3 years. Again, these are all, in a way, just the baseline facts. And as I said, does the frequency always really tell you that much? Well, let's look a bit deeper, right? So when I looked at the narratives, I came to the conclusion that there is 2 types of narratives in restructuring. One I call utilitarian, and that's 40%. So if these are restructures where I, as an outside reader, can understand why you're describing that you have a structural problem and you're taking a structural solution to that. So we have more budget, we have less budget, okay. We need better career pathways, we need more discretionary sign-offs so processes can be improved quicker. Sure, all of those things would be like, even I can understand there's some kind of structural problem you're talking about. Now that contrast that with what I call strategic aspirational restructures, and there's 60% in my sample. They are dominated by ambiguous, generic language that is, I can only call it buzzword bingo. It is the kind of, we are giving effect to a new strategy, we are implementing a new operating model, we are removing silos and creating efficiencies and becoming world-class service. And you can literally just take them off one by one. And I read all of them. So look, in strategy, that's fine. If you're starting with that at the top level, that's fine. That's strategy talk, sure. But then what doesn't happen is that any kind of link is made between these ambitions And okay, why do you restructure though? Why do you change roles, responsibilities, and and reword things? So I call this a black box logic, and this is a bit of a recall to you there, Richard. There's something, miracle happens, and then something comes out. That's what happens at 6% of the restructures, where it's really unclear why we think that newly worded roles and responsibilities make such a big difference. And so when we look at the interaction between leaders and staff, and this is also something you can analyze quite well in this data. So the feedback that staff give, particularly in these ambiguous ones, is actual practical questions and practical concerns. There's usually not a lot of criticism of the purpose of it all, because the manager's job is to set the pathway. This is where we're going. But staff usually raise some kind of operational bottlenecks that they think are going to open up, structural deficits and things that aren't clarified. So that is usually pretty consistent across all of the restructures, and equally consistent is that the response of decision makers tends to be to justify why that concern isn't necessary or it's inapplicable, or asserting that it's already part of the design. When we designed this thing, we've already thought about that, and this is going to deliver the solution, don't worry. Or to say that there's going to be some future work, we'll just get the structure into place, and then we're going to sort it all out. Yeah, we hear you, but later. Without any concrete commitment to how that will actually happen. And so I think at this point, it's fair to say that when you take any kind of strategic management handbook, there are really some points where I'm not entirely sure we're up to scruff with this practice. I've calculated the ratio of change, so between what's proposed and what finally gets implemented. So in a third of restructures, there's no change. It's exactly as proposed gets implemented. And most of the rest, so 2/3, get minimal change. So the average change ratio is 12% of whatever role title was there before and what's then finalized. Usually their role title changes. And look, they're not meaningless, but there certainly are not as fundamental as establishing a role or keeping a role that you were going to disestablish, which happens really rarely. And so at this point, it might feel a little bit like I'm razzing quite a lot on managers, like they're all terrible and they're just doing damage. But I really want to say very clearly that is not what I believe at all. I think, when we think of that term, a restructuring culture, managers are just as much part of that system, and they have to operate under certain expectations. So much of what happens comes from the very top. We have a ministerial directive, we have a new strategy, we have something that we need to answer, and arguably the best way to show we're going to look after that is by taking some really radical action. Restructures, they seem quite radical. So I wouldn't say that managers are trying, to do anything ulterior here. And also, a lot of people have been telling me that they think restructuring really is only driven by people being removed who are dead wood or who are perceived to be not a good fit for the team. Tricky thing is I can't substantiate that in my research. Probably not wrong. But would I assume that is the main driver of 484 restructures? I don't think so. My interpretation is that may be something that goes into the mix. You already have a new strategy that you want to, give effect to, or they have some other demand. Oh, and it's quite nice that I can also then have, instead of 8 business analyst roles, I have 7 business advisor roles, and everybody has to apply, and someone is not going to get a job. That does happen, but I don't think it's the main driver. I honestly don't. I think this is what's happening. I think there's a self-reinforcing cycle in how restructuring happens in New Zealand. Currently, managers carry out analysis and solution processes of restructuring away from staff in boardrooms, often with external consultants. And that's because we think of change and organizational change as a managerial prerogative. This is something that the leaders do and then tell the staff about. And the real big issue with that is you might maybe have a workshop at the beginning, and quite a few of the restructures mention an early workshop. But what happens there is usually some kind of blue skies question, what do you think is working well, what is not working so well, and then staff can talk about it. But then that information gets taken away and processed and interpreted and extrapolated. And the actual solution process is, again, done behind closed doors. So staff are only informants at a certain point and are not privy to the discussions and negotiations and weighing up of pros and cons that happen, between the managers and their advisors. That can take months in many cases. And we know from organizational psychology that these closed-door processes are incredibly prone to developing groupthink, positivity bias, path dependence, sunk cost fallacies, all of these things that make you lock into a very narrow kind of thinking, and you don't see any alternatives anymore. This is the only way we can do it. And again, I think when I've been behind the scenes of a restructure, I've seen managers really go to bat for their teams. Really try hard to get their team resources and access and influence within the organization. They really try, from my experience. But it's almost like it's a competition for resources. And how they're playing that game or how they are making the arguments, they can be quite different from what plays out in the end and what the team might want to see and argue their case. So what happens is almost you're engineering conflict, in my opinion. Because at the end of this process, the managers have fully formed plans, fully negotiated plans that get released as a consultation to the staff. And so what happens then is the staff have a week or two to react to it. And these plans may be so far removed from anything that they were maybe asked about at some point. So how is a manager who has been in this process for so long going to be able to openly and really with an open heart listen to that feedback at that point? Again, it varies across the restructures, but in the end, I believe this is a process in which staff and managers are being made to be opponents when they should be collaborating, and that's also why, in the end, when managers see what feedback comes from staff, well, they often see it as resistance. That's like, well, they don't get the plans, they don't get the bigger picture. So much of organizational change literature and even organizational change practice seems to be about comms, seems to be about we have to tell a better story and we have to get them along on a journey. But there rarely ever seems to be a question of like, hang on, is this change right? Are we actually working on the right, cogs in the machinery? And I guess if one wanted to listen back, to the staff and take some of their suggestions seriously, it would take a lot of renegotiation behind the scenes, and that's a lot of investment again. So what happens is that both sides believe managers are staff are resistant, managers are callous, and the consultation is lip service, and both sides lose trust in one another, and the cycle continues. Because of course I can't negotiate this with the staff, because look what they said last time we had a restructure. So this is the cycle that I believe that we're stuck in New Zealand. And if you want to have a look at, what happens at the end of a restructure, which is, I guess, the last neat element of this journey, these are all the restructures, 494. I sent lists of each to each organization with the restructures that they had, and I asked them to release any official information, formal or informal, of any post-restructure assessment they did. So any form of, did you actual monitor, did you do any report, even lessons learned, even something informal. Does anyone want to have a guess how many of 494? Yeah? 0? Not quite 0. 7. Yeah, 7. Yeah, Doc is in there 3 times. Go Doc, yeah. But yeah, 7. And I think best described this was by the Civil Aviation Authority that responded to me saying, following an organizational change, managers are responsible for ensuring change systems and processes are delivered and work effectively to enable achievement of the change, purpose, and objectives. Regular reporting continues following an organizational change, but is not directly linked to change processes, and clarity of change success is not monitored. I actually think this is really quite honest. I gotta say, ka pai, that is, to say it that directly, I think is really cool. Contrast that with, I'm sorry, EQC, but there you are again. Each restructure or realignment process was in of itself an indication that the objectives of the previous process had been achieved. This informal assessment of the success of each restructure provided confirmation that the objectives needed to reach the next realignment stage had been met. I did not write this. This is not a satire. Someone really wrote this to me, and that's the logic we have here. Nice. So that maybe out of everything, if there really is something that you can put your finger on and directly criticize, again, transparency, accountability, fiscal responsibility, how does that work? When restructures are such big effects, and again, like in other countries, I had a reviewer from Belgium who said, in Belgium, restructuring, also internal restructuring, has to be signed off by the Treasury because it's considered a really big financial investment. And not only in the redundancy payments that often go with it, but also with sick leave, lost opportunity costs, all of the time investment by the staff and the manager and the HR and everybody else. And you could complete the list. So at this point, there is a bit of a wider lens we can put on it as well. In the wider academic research, there's some really lovely meta-studies that are showing us that organizational change initiatives on the whole have failure rates between 60 and 90%. There's two different studies, and of course, restructuring is a type of a organizational change initiative. But that's pretty down depressing. So it does, in a way, feel like, why do we do this at all? And academia loves a good framework, and there's a million frameworks about explaining why we do what we do. My favorite one is this one from Brunson, which is called organized hypocrisy. In a way, it says it's so much easier to do a performative action than to really do the action. To actually do a transformation. So many of the restructures are talking about that we're going to change our way of working and our operating model and our behaviors and all that. That's really hard to do. There are case studies out there that show how it's done, and that typically means years and years of continuous investment, and not only of structural changes, but of loads of other, so reviews of business processes, entirely new IT tools, usually core systems. Oh my God. Many times that's a big failure. If you have the same core systems but different roles and responsibilities, they're going to end up in the same place. So you need to change, you work on culture, you need to work on training, you need to work on decision-making and financing. How do you fund and plan things? That's usually all the levers that need to be pushed and worked on for years to really achieve change. And that's very hard to do. But when you get a ministerial direction to give effect to a policy and you do a restructure, well, looks a lot like an action, doesn't it? And when we don't measure what the actual outcome of the action is, well, who's the wiser at the end, right? So with all that sounding probably quite depressing and like, oh dear, this is all not working very well, there's a few things that gave me a glimmer of hope, because this is a bit of data here from the survey. So remember, the survey was in June 2024, right, at the height of restructuring, and these are union members, these are all PSA members who responded. So I asked them, thinking of the time around the restructure, how do you rate the general need for change or improvement in your working environment then? And you see, only 20% said that there's no need. Most people, either neutral or said that there's some or even great need to change things. And I think even today in our talks, we heard some really great stories of innovation that actually goes into some very basic but essential work behaviors. And so this idea that particularly public servants are resistant to change, I don't find that at all. And at the end of the survey, I asked people to rate a few statements here. So the first one is, restructures are an effective tool for change. Even in 2024, 32% said it is, which blew my mind a little bit. Or they say restructures are necessary to make improvements. Still quite a lot of agreement. The most agreement on restructures would be better if they were applied differently. No. Or other ways of change would be better instead of restructures. So all I can see is public servants who see a need for change and who want there to be a change, but that needs to be done differently from the way it is. I see self-reinforcing dynamics keeping us in a system that seems to really not produce any efficiencies at all. No real clear pathway from going status quo to where we want to be, which is what we really would need for a public sector facing IA and democratic backsliding and all the fun things in the world. So at that point, it was the lucky thing for me as a public management nerd is that I have spent quite a few years in customer experience and service design. So I was familiar with this idea of technical debt. And so, rather than asking more questions about the efficiency of restructuring or about the frequency of it, I think it makes a lot more sense to look at the systemic conditions that create the dynamics that we're seeing today, and to look at the way by which our work is organized. So technical debt for me comes into it because so much of the public sector, when you look into it, is really shaped by software development. Did you know that Prince 2 was actually came from the UK public service? It's first an IT project management system in the 80s. So even Prince 2 is actually software development. And a lot of people nowadays say that public sector is projectified, a lovely term. But it means that almost all the work we do that isn't front-facing is in the shape of projects. And so it really shapes how we think about work, how we think about decisions, and how we think about change. And I mean, anyone here who is in an agile team, or more likely a wagile team, we're trying to do these things, and rightly so, and works better or not so good in places. But again, we're looking to software development for solutions to how we should be working in the public sector. And so I'm going to explain to you what I take as technical debt. And it's going to be a bit funny because I'm sure that there are people in the room who really understand technical debt and have worked with it. I'm going to tell you what I'm finding in papers on Google Scholar. So this is going to be, there's an absolute potential that this is going to be a little embarrassing for me. But this is why we have the afternoon session, which I'm much looking forward to, and hoping many of you will come and tell me your stories about technical debt and why maybe everything I'm saying here is wrong. I'm entirely open to it. So what I found is this quote here, shipping first-time code is like going into debt. A little debt speeds development so long as it is paid back promptly with a rewrite. And so for anyone who doesn't know technical debt, really the idea is if I'm in a complex iterative process like developing a piece of software, I will either have to sometimes make compromises, like not do as thorough documentation as I should because I need to move on because I want to ship something, or I might not actually know all the factors yet. I might not have the research in yet. I might not know all the potential outcomes that my decision will have. So I will, with each of my decisions, accrue a little bit of debt, and that's actually fine, as long as I, account for it. And so another quote here is, debt arises when my ideas diverge from my code. And that happens almost inevitably because of bounded rationality. But importantly, debt is not the same as dysfunction. So debt is not something that is a bug or where something actually doesn't work or breaks. It is inherent to the iterative nature of development and only becomes problematic when it is being ignored. And so for me, that was a real big kind of hang on, there's something here moment. Now, this is a chart by Kurten et al., which from 2012, which I think really explains the whole landscape the best. So what you see here in this blue box, that is technical debt. So anything in this blue box is technical debt. So you have architecture debt, structural debt, documentation. Someone tell me what code smells is later, but it sounds great. So all that is in there, and you can see above it is a red line that says it's mostly invisible. Because again, if it's actually a bug, so on this far end here, it's like a spectrum at the bottom. So at the far end here, that is visible, we have defects and low external quality. So we clearly have issues here, and that's why we have maintainability issues at the bottom. If you're having lots of bugs in your code, that is going to really drag you down over time. And on the other end of the scale, you have, on the visible side, you have new features, additional functionality, and those are evolvability. So that is actually where you want to be. If your code is pretty light of debt, if it's pretty flexible, then you will be able to evolve and get to those new features quicker. And that, again, is visible. But the more invisible stuff in the middle is what you have to worry about. And so I would suggest that there is organizational debt that articulates the residual cost of decision-making under constraint that only becomes problematic when ignored. And I think when you see my emphasis there and what I've been telling about my research, you may know where I'm going with my thinking here. I also should absolutely highlight, I'm not the first one to use this term. There have been quite a few blog posts of people who came to the exact same kind of conclusion. Hang on, technical debt should be actually way bigger. This idea, particularly of organizational development, is iterative, it's complex, it's very similar, in the way of working and thinking. And so we should think of organizational debt. Though I will argue that I've probably gone a little bit deeper than some of the blog posts. So what I can show you here is, because what I have is these 7 reports that were done, they will help me actually articulate a bit more in detail what that means. But first of all, maybe to kind of pad out a bit more of why organizational debt should be helping us with restructuring. I think it is crucial that we recognize the iterative nature of internal change. And again, this is a bit counterintuitive against the whole frequency of restructuring is difficult. But if we actually understand that change is continuous and that whenever a manager or anyone else who has some kind of influence in the organization makes decisions or has conversations, they are made under uncertainty and they will require trade-offs and compromises. And so I think when you look at the narratives and these conversations in my restructuring research, right now we seem to have this one best way approach to change, where it's like, I have a certain challenge, I'm going to write the perfect story, a fantastic, convincing narrative that everybody's going to find convincing, and we're going to make the best org chart we could possibly have. We're going to get that in place, and then it works. And after that, not much thought to it, as we've seen. But if we move away from that thinking and actually emphasize the responsibility to recognize and actively address the evolving consequences of your imperfect decision-making, that might really move us forward. I think it's also important in that we need to shift away from any kind of idea of blame. Because if we see a restructure as a one best way, you need to do the right restructuring for your team. That also means if you are found to, that restructuring you didn't actually do what you wanted it to do, well, that's a failure for you as a manager, and that's going to get on your report card in a bad way. Well, that's not, that's a problem, because that's going to cause us a lot of resistance to any kind of, changing mind. So that's not that is in a way that the concept that keeps us locked into this cycle where we're not measuring anything and we're keeping people out of the boardroom. So we need to move to a constructive system-aware discourse and open the door to an active exchange between the staff and managers. Because if we want to recognize what organizational debt occurs after a restructure or other organizational change, you will need to talk to your staff. And you'll need to actually recognize that some of this will be invisible, will be latent, it will be feelings people have, code smells. And so that needs to be part of a new openness, which has to also come from both sides. And I'll speak to that a bit later. But ultimately, I hope that this can establish greater transparency and control for the managers as well as for political leaders, and closer align with public sector values. Now, I mentioned I have 7 reports out of the 494 that have actually gone back and measured, right? So there is actually a little bit of an example I have where I can see, well, if there was organizational debt, then what would it be? And analyzing these, I got some pretty clear themes out of it. The first one won't surprise you. The after effects of restructuring are cultural and workforce effects, staff morale, anxiety, bullying. Risk-averse and avoidant behavior is really, really common. There is it's a great paper that says restructuring turns staff into victims, survivors, and endurers. And that really hit home for me personally, just with the ones I've been through. But yeah, I think in a way that's what a lot of us probably have been through ourselves and feel. We know that they're not, popular processes with staff. But maybe surprisingly, these 7 reports almost unanimously found what I would call plan-reality discrepancies. So when I looked into what was the original plan of each restructure, usually it was something about clarifying roles and, better ways of working and behaviors. And then the reports a year on usually would find the exact same problems, but just in a different nature. Or they have new silos now. Or these people are on the same too, but they're still not talking. And the new roles are even less clear than they were before. Then you have operational systems, because typically, as I said, these structural interventions are not really accompanied by any other methods. So you don't have the training to support what's supposed to happen, the change of behavior that you might want to see. And so you have, not enough knowledge, not enough expertise. Also, if you have been playing that kind of game of, I'm going to establish and disestablish a certain number of roles, and some people will not come home, the next time, or not come back to work, you might also lose quite a few people who you didn't want losing from the team, and then you end up with a lot less staff to begin with. That happens in almost all of these 7 examples. And that also leads to relational and reputational effects, so both internally, so between managers and staff. This is also in the biggest part of the survey, I guess, the people losing trust in their managers because of the communication, because they felt they weren't genuinely spoken to or listened to. That can really ruin managerial relationships. But even with outside partners, if you've been busy restructuring, you very likely didn't really, you weren't the greatest business partner, or maybe even customers might be feeling the pain. So if I'm just copy and pasting the lovely picture by Kruchten et al. And fill it in with my research from the organizational debt idea, we still have the same kind of graph here with, on one hand, we have visible issues like actual failures, errors and delays in the public service, rework and low effectiveness. Now, those are visible quality issues. I think the most recent example I can think of was ACC's customer transformation. They had to walk that back. As far as I remember, that was causing genuinely measurable and quite difficult issues that had to be resolved. But that doesn't happen very often. The visibility is normally not there. And then in the blue box, we have all those forms of debt that I was able to find in the reporting as it happens. And I'd love your thoughts on those, by the way, again, in a later session, if you see any of these that I'm missing or think some of them are, overstated. And the important bit, in a way, is the far end here, the visible end of what is evolvability, right? This is where we actually have updates and improvements to the public service. And I guess, in a way, what this graph is saying is that if we want the public service to be able to adopt new ways of working and change its behavior, it's going to be a lot harder if you drag on a lot of debt. If your staff has low morale and churn, you have less expertise, risk-avoidant people, friction between managers and staff, and strategic shortfalls, you're going to be less able to, get onto that new agile idea that your manager got so excited about. So this is something that really material can impact the ability of public management to change. And so I've had a bit of a think of, if that idea is all, well and good, and, that sounds really reasonable and likely, but some people who know technical debt might also be able to tell me, the theory and the practice are a little bit different though, right? It's a really lovely idea. But the problem is, and even the literature is saying this, that development teams rarely hold the authority to authorize debt remediation. And developers feel the pain but lack the power. So I think this is an incredibly important, if we're learning from technical debt, then we absolutely must learn this as well. That it's very well having some kind of record of technical debt, but if there is no way or no authority or no responsibility at the right level to remediate it, to do something about it, well then, it's like, it's a lovely bullet diary, but that's not much more than that. And so these are just some ramblings, I suppose, at the end of a twisted end of thesis mind. But what would it take to establish an idea like organizational debt? Currently, there is next to no formal monitoring of whether restructuring meets its intended effects, and the full extent of the cost of restructuring is unclear. So we would actually need to anchor the responsibility to recognize and manage organizational debt at the highest levels of management. I think that would be the only way to do it. And that's a pretty tall order. It would ideally be transparent to the government of the day. So, if I'd imagine, the conversations that to my understanding, are happening at those higher levels, is a lot of negotiations. But I guess I'm hoping that if you were aware of the organizational debt, if you had a vocabulary for that, if you had ways to track and monitor it, could that be part of the discussion to say, that's a lovely idea, we need to definitely work on that new strategy, but we have this debt that we need to take into account when we're making our plans. I might be dreaming here. So I gotta say, I'm not entirely sure whether this idea would ever really land with decision makers, because it is a way of making them more accountable. And who wants to be held more accountable? So I just want to be honest about how I feel about it. This may be one of those theory and practice differences, but again, I'm really hoping we can discuss that later on in our other session. Currently, the restructuring is dominated by abstracted and generic justifications and ambiguous goals that often replace and rearrange existing roles. if we had a concept of organizational debt that would be accountable for, and if we understood change as iterative and continuous, we would also need to break down our goals, in a bit more of a measurable and articulatable way, So from that top layer, which is fine. If you want to say we want to, adopt a new way of working, cool. But then we need the next layer down from that, and the next layer down needs to contain practical methods and looking into governance and procurement and business processes and IT tools, all the things that enable actual change. And be explicitly linked to those goals. And finally, staff involvement is currently minimal, and operational concerns are not taken seriously. So the same concerns that I found in the consultations were just right there in all of these post-assessment, all of the 7 post-assessment documents. So it's almost like the staff actually had a point. And so the design of changes, I believe, needs to be fundamentally more collaborative. Look, there is, of course, a legal limit to this. Employment law and confidentiality means, of course, that certain things, about pay grades can't be just openly discussed in a kumbaya singing circle, okay? But there must be, and there are ways of co-designing and co-governance that can be taken more seriously and that can be applied. None of this is employing any new methods. It's bringing in methods that the public sector is actually expected to do with customers already and do it on the inside. Which, if you think about it, is quite bizarre that we expect so many of our public services to do co-design, and then the staff internally have no rights to designing their own working environments, really, other than, reactive consultation. The difficult thing, I think, here is that you would have to bring trust back to the table. Remember in my little flow chart there, my little circle? But, what we always lose is trust between both sides. So in a way, you would need managers to trust that staff can be, constructive and can bring meaningful and important information and be part of the negotiation, not only as informants, but also staff would need to trust that they can speak openly, that they can, contribute something, and that they will be taken serious, which I think, I myself, it's so easy to get cynical in this. And so I think it would be quite tough to get everybody back around the table talking if we assume we got to this point. So we might be able to learn a little bit from those more utilitarian restructures. But honestly, I think as a package, the center of it for me is the collaboration between staff and managers, the one that's currently not working. So I guess as a final thought, I really think this is, I'm a last year PhD student. I think my work is the most important thing in the universe. Of course I do. Because I've not seen humans, I've not really talked to anyone else. I've been in a cave. But I really think that so much of what I'm reading about in the public sector, I can only just think that how can we achieve goals? How can we deal with AI? How can we respond to everything that's raining on us if we don't have a robust way in which we can make our own organizations change? I'm just locked into that thought, I'm sorry. And so for me, it's not only necessary but inevitable that we bring a more collaborative and more trusting way of leading change and measured way of leading change into public management. And so I hope that the idea of organizational debt can be something of a vocabulary, something to frame, something that we already know is there, and we can usually kind of, wave our hands at it. But it's not necessarily always so easy to articulate. So if we have a concept like this, maybe it helps us bring some of it out into, out of the closet and into the spotlight. And most importantly, reframe the relationship between people with different hierarchical power. And that's all I have. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annika, for what was actually a really thought-provoking session. I was thinking as you were talking, there was something for me going back to what the Reverend was talking about earlier about respect. And, if we can all have respect for each other as people, whether we're a manager or an employee, I think that will go a long way to helping build that trust and being able to collaborate together.